Chapter 5 The Musalman Conquest of Gingee, 1639 to 59. The Nayaks of Gingee and Madura had already played an inglorious but substantial part in the civil war of 1614 to 17 against the Loyalists. After Muttu Veerappa Nayaka of Madura, the famous Tirumala Nayaka came to power. He is held to have begun to rule perhaps from 1623 or 1624, though Veerappa died only in 1627 and he became actual ruler in his own right only in 1627 to 28. Tirumala Nayak of Madura asserted his independence by refusing to pay his tribute to Sri Ranga III. According to the letter of Father Proenza, dated AD 1659, the Nayaks of Madura had been unpunctual in the payment of tribute. And now Tirumala Nayak refused to pay it altogether, having resolved to free himself entirely from every kind of imperial control. Tirumala's policy towards his overlord was in the first instance to humor him with occasional presents while desisting from paying any regular tribute. After his war with Mysore, paying and the invasion of Travancore, Tirumala naturally turned against the emperor. The subordination of the Madura Nayak to Venkata at the time of the issue of the Kuniyur plates in AD 1634, noted in Epigraphica Indica, Volume 3, pages 236 to 258, and Madras Epigraphical Report, 1891, page 9, is plain from the wording. But there may be another meaning found in the expression Srimat Tirumalendrasya Vignapti Manupalayan, which really means in accordance with the wishes of the prosperous and eminent ruler Tirumala. Jesuit evidence says that Tirumala aimed at practical independence by non-payment of tribute. Bijapur intervention in the affairs of the Carnatic. Even early in the reign of Venkatapati Raya, his hold on Penukonda was threatened by a vigorously aggressive attitude on the part of Golconda. Raja Udayar of Mysore captured Seringapatam in 1610, and the Raya was then in no position to punish him for this aggressive act. He had to ratify Raja Udayar's possession of Srirangapatam by a charter and even allowed him to rule over the territories that were hitherto under the Viceroy of Srirangapatam in AD 1612. This viceroyalty had comprehended the charges of number 1, Srirangapatam himself, number 2, the territory subjected to Chennapatna, which happened to be under a governor, Jaggadeva Rayal, and number 3, the so-called Baramahal region of Salem. The viceroy was also in controlling charge of the area ruled by the Nayak of Ikkeri and the frontiers of Srirangapatnam. Raja Udayar could not get effective hold of all these regions. His grandson, Chamaraja Udayar, achieved by steps the conquest of the Chennapatna governorship without the Baramahals. He also made an attempt upon Ikkeri. His successor brought about a Bijapur invasion in order to divert the attention of his enemy, the Nayak of Ikkeri. One of the petty polygas in the neighborhood of Ikkeri was Kenga Hanuma of Basavapattana, and he, along with a few of his fellow polygas, was set up against Veerabhadra Nayak of Ikkeri. But Veerabhadra put down Kenge Hanuma and other rebels and dispossessed the farmer of his fief. Thereupon, Kenge Hanuma went over to the Bijapur court to solicit the aid of its sultan against the Nayak. Already a similar appeal had been made to Bijapur by another polygar, Chennaya of Nagamangala, who had been deprived of his fief by Chamaraja Udayar. Just at this time, peace had been established between the Bijapur Sultan and the Mughals who had been troubling him. and he readily accepted the invitation to intervene and undertook what may be called the first Musalman invasion of Mysore. The invading army was under the command of Ranadullah Khan, and it reinstated Genge Hanuma in AD 1638-39. After restoring King Hanuma, the Bijapurians took possession of the three provinces of Ikkeri, Sira, and Bangalore, the last of which was under the viceroyalty of the powerful Jagadeva Rayal, but had been lately conquered by Mysore. The Bijapurians next laid siege to Mysore and Srirangapatnam simultaneously, but they encountered a most unexpected and vigorous resistance, and the whole campaign ended in a treaty by which the Bijapurians took all the country to the north of the Kaveri, including Bangalore and Sira. Ranadullah Khan left Genge Hanuma in charge of the territories now acquired by him and returned to Bijapur. Now Veerabhadra Nayak of Ikkeri reported against Genge Hanuma to Bijapur, alleging that the latter was disloyal to the Sultan. Thereupon, a commission of inquiry was ordered by the Bijapur government to investigate the matter, and among the commissioners was Channaya of Nagamangala. Genge Hanuma, however, behaved in a very treacherous manner towards this commission, while Kantira of Mysore was not at all anxious to fulfill his obligations to Bijapur under the treaty and continued to give trouble. Ranadullah Khan thereupon put to disgrace, and two of his successors in command of the invading armies, the latter of them being Mustafa Khan, had to march against Srirangapatnam to punish the Mysore ruler, but were unable to do anything. A fourth invasion by Abdullah Khan and Hemaji Pandit was not able to do much more. Taking advantage of this weakness of Bijapur, Kantira Vanarasa resumed the Channapatna viceroyalty, entered the Kongu territory, and forcibly took possession of Satyamangalam, and thus came into hostility with the Nayak of Madura. Kantira Vanarasa was the contemporary of Tirumala Nayak and was frequently engaged in struggles with him, mainly owing to his encroachments into the Kongu territory. Throughout the region of Venkatapati Raya, the administration of the Raya was controlled by the Velugoti brothers of Kalahasti, of whom Damarla Venkatadri, or Venkatappa as he is called in Dutch records, who was the chief of Vandivash, was the most important. His brother Ayyappa resided at Punamalli to the west of Madras and administered his territory for him, while Venkatappa remained at the headquarters of the Raya and helped him in the general administration of the empire. It was from these two brothers that the English obtained the grant of Fort St. George, which in the company's letters was ascribed to the great Nayaka Damarla Venkata. When Venkatapati Raya died in 1642, Sriranga, his nephew, succeeded. But the Damarla brothers did not desire his succession, and in combination with the other governors created a considerable amount of discontent. Venkata had apparently championed some other claimant, and he was seized and put in confinement by the new monarch. But his kinsmen raised a large army and hoped to restore him to freedom with the aid of the Mohammedans, whom they were hardly expecting, or else to ruin the whole kingdom. Sriranga was a stronger man than his predecessor and was bent upon consolidating the central authority. Sriranga was not only a pious sovereign, but one endowed with political insight and vigor. He tried alternately to establish a control over the great Nayak chiefs and to use them against the Muslim enemies. Quote, though his efforts were not crowned with success, justice requires he should be given credit for putting them forth. End of quote. His authority was recognized during a considerable part of his reign over a large portion of his kingdom. Certainly, he was not a sovereign merely in name. Sriranga successfully beat off an invasion of Golconda in 1644, and there was no interruption in the dating of his records down to 1649. Though he lost Vellore in 1645, The decade 1649 to 59 is barren of inscriptions. Sriranga ascended the throne towards the end of 1642. Soon after his accession, the rulers of Bijapur and Golconda began an invasion of his territories, and the Jesuit letters of the times mention the Mohammedan invasions as being the result of Sriranga's dealings with the southern Nayaks. Sriranga had already invaded the dominions of Tirumala Nayak, who had entered into an agreement with his neighbors of Tanjore and Gingee, and when the Nayak of Tanjore divulged the schemes of his allies to Sriranga, the latter turned on Gingee. Tirumala now sought the help of the Sultan of Golconda, whose invasion Sriranga succeeded in resisting. When the Sultan made active preparations to renew his attack on the Raya, Sriranga entered into negotiations with the southern Nayaks and court spent more than a year with the three Nayaks in the midst of festivities, feasts, and pleasures, during which the Mohammedans quietly achieved the conquest of his dominions. Soon, vain joys gave place to jealousies and divisions. Rejected again by the Nayaks, Sriranga established his court in the forests of Kallans, lying to the north of Tanjore, where he spent 4 months, a prey to all discomforts. His courtiers soon abandoned him. End of quote. Anyhow, Sriranga's plans did not unfortunately succeed. He soon lost even his capital. Vellore wandered about the country, became a refugee at the court of Kantira Vanarasa of Mysore, and with the help of the latter, recovered a portion of his old territories and defeated the Golconda army, which advanced to an attack. Sivappa Nayak of Ikkeri, who ruled from 1645 to 60, who possessed an enormous treasure and an army of 40 to 50,000 men, now came to the help of Sriranga and assisted in the recovery of Vellore from the Muslims. It was possible that Sriranga fled to Sivappa Nayak, who had suffered at the hands of Ranadullah Khan and now advanced against the Mohammedans in the occupation of Vellore. He commenced a regular blockade of it and soon reduced it to submission. Sriranga was enabled to return to Vellore and honor Sivappa Nayak with many titles, including those of Ramabhana and Paravarana Varana. It is also stated in the Sivatattva Ratnakara that Sriranga presented Sivappa with the head of his enemy, which perhaps meant the general of the Golconda forces in charge of Vellore at the time that it surrendered. Shivappa Nayak is also said to have subdued some of the recalcitrant feudatories of the empire and handed over their dominions to Sriranga. Inscriptions dated from 1645 to 46 to 1649, signifying the continued rule of Sriranga, issued not from the recorded capital of Penukonda, but his personal residence at Vellore. It may therefore be assumed that the restoration of Sriranga to Vellore took place shortly before this period. The Jesuit records say that Sriranga was victorious against Golconda on 2 occasions, and that on the second occasion he was helped by the Mysore army. It is the second victory that is celebrated in the Sivatattva Ratnakara. It is also about this time that the English at Madras got from Sriranga a confirmation of the charters for the settlement, and their envoys were received by him at Vellore. This was after Sriranga had secured a victory and probably put down the machinations of Damarla Venkatappa. An English letter of the time says that Sriranga's authority was now stronger than ever, and that he had brought all his great lords under his command, which hath not been this 40 years before. The Raya's letter to the English inviting them to confide in his word was dated Arlore or Vellore, 25th September 1645. His grant to the English after the visit of their agent Greenhill to his court was dated October to November 1645. A letter of the Madras Council of 1645 says that Sriranga had by that time brought his enemies under control and had restored himself to his original position. The Dutch governor of Pulicat, writing about a year before, had said that the Golconda invaders could not attack Pulicat, finding it well equipped. The Nayak of Gingee, who was then in rebellion against Sriranga, advanced with the intention of joining the Golconda army, whereupon the Raya recalled the army of Krishnappa Nayak, who was operating against the Gingee chief, and restored Chinnana, that is Mallaya, to favor. Krishnappa fell unexpectedly on the Moors and completely routed them, killing their commander and several other captains. Mallaya was entrusted with the task of putting down the power of the Damarla brothers and of subduing their forts on the coast. Mallai alias Chinnana Chetty had been brokered to the Dutch at Pulicat. He was at first hostile to the English at Madras and was Kyoto, apparently an astute man who not only managed to supersede Venkatadri in the Pulicat province but also did good business as the Indian merchant through whom the Dutch made their investments on the coast. End of quote. Sriranga generally favored Mallaya and was helped by him, probably in securing Dutch aid in the manner of completely taking possession of Venkatadri's territories. This was in 1643. The English feared that Mallai, who was assisted by the Dutch with guns and men, and had been appointed the local governor as well as the treasurer of the Raya, and raised to a position where he does in a manner command all, would soon govern all the seaports even to the very verges of Ceylon. Quoted from letter from Fort St. George to Bantam, 28th January 1643. When the Golconda troops laid siege to Pulicat, because the Dutch had joined Sriranga, the English feared that the turn of Madras would follow. Mallaya had tried to mollify the Moors with presents, but could not avert the siege. Fortunately, Sriranga's troops routed the Golconda forces and pursued them up to Udayagiri, where they gained a victory, probably the one referred to in the Rama Rajyamu and attributed to Sriranga in September 1644. Mallaya had later to fight the Dutch and besieged Pulicat. The siege lasted several months, after which the besieging troops had to be withdrawn on account of the Raya having to fight enemies elsewhere. In the beginning of 1646, Mallaya very cleverly recovered his old position of confidence and influence with the Dutch, who were tired of hostilities, and received him into favor, though, as the jealous English said, he was of little use to them on account of the great alteration and present poverty of those parts. Golconda did not take its defeat easily. Mir Jumla, the minister of Golconda, now allied himself with Bijapur and even applied to the Raja of Mysore for assistance. And in the Madras records dated January 1646, we read that Sriranga was definitely attacked by both Bijapur and Golconda. Mir Jumla took possession of Udayagiri, which was the capital of the eastern portion of the kingdom of the Raya, from Mallaya. The surrender of Udayagiri depressed Mallaya, who was the governor of that region in succession to Damarla Venkatappa. We learn that the Raya fled, leaving the defense operations to Mallaya, who proved treacherous and surrendered the strongest hold in the kingdom to Mir Jumla upon composition for himself and all his people to go away free. In October 1647, the company obtained a renewal of the grant of Madras from Mir Jumla, while the Raya had fled from the coast region definitely. Mir Jumla now marched upon Gingee, having strengthened himself by an alliance with Bijapur. Before the walls of Gingee, the Bijapur troops joined the Golconda forces and were allowed by the latter to occupy the place. The Bijapur army took possession of Gingee and also Tegnapattam near Kadalur, and it was now that Sriranga took refuge with the ruler of Mysore, who was then at war with Bijapur. The Bijapur occupation of Gingee and the coast country near it intensified the prevailing famine and depression of trade. Food became dear, cotton goods were difficult to obtain, Porto Novo and Pondicherry were in a manner ruined, while Tegnapatam was fleeced very much. Soon afterwards, probably in 1648, Mir Jumla came to be at war with Bijapur. This war between Bijapur and Golconda lasted some years. Bijapur now captured Penukonda and wanted permission to march to Gingee, through the territory belonging to Mir Jumla. It was now that Mir Jumla sought the assistance of Mysore and even made overtures of friendship to Sriranga. The Bijapur army advanced up to Vellore, took possession of it, and left Sriranga stranded, with perhaps Chandragiri for his capital and a few miles of territory dependent thereon. This can be regarded as the second flight of Sriranga from his capital. Let us revert to a survey of events leading to the Musalman penetration to Gingee, Vellore, and the rest of the Carnatic country down to the first capture of Gingee in 1648. In the half a century of confusion that intervened between the Battle of Toppur and the death of Shaji in 1664, Mysore did some service to the Hindu Empire by resisting the aggressions of Bijapur, though ultimately the latter power was able to occupy the districts of Chitaldurg, Tumkur, and Kolar, and also one half of Bangalore. Through all the vicissitudes of the empire in this epoch, Madura discharged no such duty either to herself or to the empire. In one sense, indeed, Mysore could claim to have acted as the champion of the empire, while Madura had not that credit or claim. When Sriranga III ascended the throne of Chandragiri sometime about 1642, the empire was in a very bad condition and could barely maintain an unequal struggle for existence, chiefly through the want of loyalty of the feudatories of the south, particularly of the powerful Tirumala Nayak of Madura. The Raya made, even soon after his accession, an organized effort to bring these Nayaks under effective allegiance to a non-cooperation with him. In this move of his, he could let Mysore go on her own path, as she had so far committed herself to no open act of disloyalty, but on the other hand, by actually occupying the region of the previous Channapatna viceroyalty, had put herself in the way of the aggressions of Bijapur, thus rendering a positive service to the empire, though only indirectly. With regard to the aggressions of Golconda, the empire had to bear the brunt alone and unaided. Madura, which was the only strong feudatory power, did not perceive this root danger to the cause of Hindu independence, and its non-cooperation and frequent treachery might be regarded as constituting one of the primary factors responsible for the gradual extinction of the Hindu empire. This evil was largely due to the attitude of Tirumala Nayak. Mysore openly threw off its nominal allegiance to Vijayanagar only in 1646 when it was threatened seriously by Golconda. It was now that Shaji, the Maratha general of Bijapur, showed himself in his most important aspect as the ultimate savior of the Hindu cause. Along with Ranadullah Khan, he had attacked the Nayak of Ikeri and occupied his capital as well as one half of his kingdom in 1637-38. 2 years later, he once again helped in the defeat of the Nayak, but also contributed to his subsequent restoration to his principality. It was about this time also that the Nayak of Sira was defeated and killed treacherously by Afzal Khan, one of the Bijapur generals, in the course of an attempted negotiation. Sira was handed over to Kenga Hanuma of Basavapatnam, the sworn enemy of the Nayak of Ikeri, while Kempegowda, the chief of Bangalore, was likewise threatened into submission and forced to retire to Savandurga. Shaji had been promised Jagir in these new conquests of Bijapur and was actually given charge of Bangalore in 1638. He subdued the Udayar ruler of Seringapatam, Kantirava Narasaraja, but arranged to leave him undisturbed in possession of his territory and fort. He is also credited, according to the Shiva Bharat, with winning over the Nayaks of Madura and Kaveri Patam to his side. He distinguished himself again by an attack on Kenge Hanuma of Basavapatnam. A most noteworthy achievement of Shaji at this point of his career was his attempt at the formation of a confederacy of the local Nayaks and of several Maratha and Muslim chiefs in support of the Bijapur invaders against the powerful Nayaks of Ikeri, particularly Shivappa, who had indeed restored and vastly increased the strength of that state, and who showed himself a warm supporter of the cause of the Hindu empire. In 1644 and in subsequent years, Shahji contrived to earn further honors for himself and to organize a combination of the Nayaks of Gingee, Madura, and Tanjore against the opposition of the Raya and against Jagadeva of Kaveripatnam. When Vellore was invested by the Bijapur forces, Shahji commanded the right wing of the army and was given the charge of the place, along with a Muhammadan colleague, as well as the high titles of Maharaja and Farzand. Shahji contrived to become, by 1648, the effective governor of all the Bijapur conquests from the Ghats, hence called Karnatak Bijapur Balaghat. He ruled over all these territories from Bangalore, but sometimes also from Kolar and Dodballapur. When the great campaign of 1648 was being waged by Bijapur against Gingee, consequent on its investment by Mir Jumla, the famous general of Golconda, Shahji, found that the Bijapur troops, instead of helping Tirumala Nayak of Madura, who had repented of his short-sighted policy and sought an alliance with them for the defense of the Gingee Nayak, was actually in league with the foe. He saw that his Muslim colleague had come to a secret understanding with the enemy and therefore contrived to prolong the operations. After the Bijapurians had acquired Gingee towards the end of 1648, Shahji became even more powerful than before. Even during the course of the operations against the place, Nawab Mustafa Khan, the Bijapur generalissimo, had begun to fear that Shahji was helping the enemies and was even then secretly planning a powerful combination of the Hindu rulers of the country, consisting of the Nayaks of Madura, Tanjore, and Gingee, and the chiefs of Mysore, Kaveripatnam, and Ikkeri. The coalition to be headed by the Emperor Sriranga and Shahji himself. There followed shortly afterwards Shahji's imprisonment at Bijapur at the instance of his redoubtable enemy Mustafa Khan. His release from prison must have been due in some measure to the opportune death of his enemy Mustafa Khan and partly to the threatening attitude of the Mughals, who now began a series of attacks on the northern frontier of Bijapur. In the course of the expeditions of the Khan-e-Khanan Muzaffaruddin in 1644-45 and of Nawab Mustafa Khan in the year 1646-48, Shahji had contrived to gain further honors for himself. The campaign of 1644 had been the outcome of an alliance between Bijapur and Srirangaraya of Vellore, who was opposed by a powerful combination of the Golconda Sultan and his own ministers and Nayak feudatories. In the latter campaign led by the Bijapur general Mustafa Khan, he organized a combination of the Nayaks of Gingee, Madura, and Tanjore, and also those of Harpanahalli and Ikkeri against the determined opposition of Srirangaraya. He fought in January 1646 against Jagadeva, the Raja of Kaveripatnam, and forced him to take refuge in Krishnadurg and also compelled the Raya to take to flight. Subsequently, the Bijapur army annexed a large part of the Baramahals and proceeded against Vellore, under the walls of which a terrible battle was fought, in which the slaughter on the Hindu side was very great. In this, Shahji commanded the right wing of the victorious army. Then followed an investment of the fort of Vellore and the submission of the Raya, who paid a large indemnity in gold and gave 150 elephants. Shahji and the Muhammadan colleague were left in charge of the government of the conquered territories. The Golconda forces also joined in this campaign. The campaign against Vellore was the outcome of events by which Golconda had contrived to annex a good part of the Carnatic on the eastern side, from Masulipatam on the coast down to the neighborhood of Madras. The contracted power of the Raya of Vellore was thus hemmed in on both sides by its two old enemies, Bijapur and Golconda. Udaygiri was captured by the Golconda forces in 1646. The internal dissensions that now beset the disintegrating kingdom of the Raya were worsened by the infectious treachery of the brothers Damarla Venkatadri and Ayyappa, who called in the aid of Golconda, and this treachery was copied by Tirumala Nayak of Madura, who seduced the Nayaks of Tanjore and Gingee over to his side. Though the Nayak of Tanjore went back to his loyalty, Tirumala Naik ultimately brought about the breakup of the Vijayanagar Empire by his continued treachery. By 1645, Mir Jumla, the general of the Golconda forces, had successfully penetrated the country as far as Vellore, advancing by way of Ongole, Nellore, and Chittoor. At the same time, the Bijapur forces also converged on Vellore. The combined forces first laid siege to Vellore about the beginning of 1645 AD. Srirangaraya had to flee for his life, leaving the defense to one Mallaya, who proved treacherous and surrendered to the forces of Mir Jumla upon composition for himself and all his people. Sriranga then sought the help of Sivappa Naik of Ikkeri, and the latter took advantage of the opportunity to advance against Vellore and to reduce it to submission. The restoration of Sriranga by Sivappa Naik was a great service to the Hindu cause. It led to Sriranga granting him the titles of Ramabhana and Paravarana Varana, Taranga 14, Kallola 7 of Keladi Basavas Shivatattva Ratnakara. We have a number of inscriptions testifying to the continuous and effective rule of Sriranga from 1645-46 to 1649, and this would lead to the inference that Sriranga was then in undisputed occupation of the interior country, at least round Vellore. In 1648, there was waged the great campaign against Gingee, which had been invested by Mir Jumla. This campaign was now induced by Tirumala Naik of Madura, who repented of his short-sighted policy and sought an alliance with the Bijapur ruler, and with the help of the latter, marched to relieve Gingee from the forces of Mir Jumla. But the Muslims soon came to an understanding among themselves, and Tirumala Naik could not effectively help the defense of Gingee. In the course of the operations, Shaji, as noted above, being dissatisfied with the conduct of Mustafa Khan, the commander-in-chief, contrived to prolong the operations, while Mir Jumla took advantage of the dissensions among the generals of the Bijapur army and even formed a secret alliance with the Raya. The Naik of Gingee was at last forced to surrender to the Bijapur army towards the end of December 1649. The city of Gingee was given over to plunder, and the victors got several crores worth of cash and jewels. In this campaign, the Pindari freebooters, who always hung in the rear of the army, were allowed to spread desolation and devastation through the land, particularly round the ports of Devanampatam, Porto Novo, and Puducherry, afterwards to become the French settlement. After this Bijapurian acquisition of Gingee, Shaji became easily even more powerful than before. The rebellious conduct of his son Shivaji against the Adil Shah led to secret orders from Bijapur for the arrest of Shaji. According to the Muhammad Nama, some incidents occurred during the siege of Gingee that led to a misunderstanding between him and Nawab Mustafa Khan. Sir J. N. Sarkar holds that the arrest of Shaji was due to his disloyal intrigues with the Raya of Vellore and with the Sultan of Golconda. Shaji had now become the virtual ruler of the Carnatic, and probably he thought that he might throw off the yoke of Bijapur and become openly independent. Perhaps Shaji did not like the idea of Nawab Mustafa Khan making common cause with Mir Jumla. Perhaps also Mustafa Khan might, by having Shaji arrested, have planned to forestall a powerful combination of the Hindu rulers of the country consisting of the Nayaks of Madura, Gingee and Tanjore, and of the chiefs of Mysore, Kaveri Patnam and Ikkeri, headed by Sriranga and Shaji himself. Shaji returned to his charge and in 1651 got a definite victory over Mir Jumla, who had made himself the effective master of a rich tract of country on the Madras coast, and also concluded a peace with Sriranga. This defeat of Mir Jumla greatly enhanced the reputation of Shaji and gave a new vigor to the campaigns of the Bijapurians, who contrived to capture the important fortress of Penukonda. This loss of Penukonda greatly alarmed the Hindu ruler, and Sriranga at first appealed for help to Prince Aurangzeb, then the Mughal viceroy of the Deccan. He even contrived to reconquer, with the help of the Mysore ruler, a part of his territory and to regain Vellore for a time. Vellore was quickly recaptured by the Bijapur forces, and the Raya was forced to conclude a treaty by which he had to be content with the possession of Chandragiri and the revenues of certain adjoining districts. Even from these, the Raya was ultimately driven out by the treachery of the Nayak of Madura and had to finally seek shelter with Sivappa Nayak. In September 1654, the English factors at Madras reported that the Sultan of Golconda suspected Mir Jumla of a plan to make himself the independent sovereign of the districts he had brought under his control in South India with the help of Bijapur. Aurangzeb, the Mughal viceroy of the Deccan, who was eagerly waiting for an opportunity to interfere in the affairs of the Deccan sultans, caught Mir Jumla in his own net of persuasive intrigue, and the latter agreed to enter the service of the Mughal emperor. This news so alarmed the Sultan of Golconda that he sought to win back the friendship of his old minister, and Mir Jumla consequently wavered in his attitude and delayed joining the service of the Mughals till the later part of 1655, when the Sultan imprisoned his family at Golconda, having been provoked into action by the haughty behavior of his son. So Mir Jumla precipitated his breach with his master and betook himself to the camp of Aurangzeb openly. Mir Jumla got a confirmation of his possessions in the Carnatic from Shah Jahan and continued his advance in that region up to July 1656. In November 1656, Sri Ranga had recovered some districts and laid siege to Pulicat as against Mir Jumla, very likely with the support of the king of Golconda, who was angry that the Mughal emperor should have decided to treat as his dominion whatever Mir Jumla had conquered in the Carnatic and had ordered the Sultan to recall his officers from these territories. Sriranga took advantage of this attitude of Golconda and called upon his father-in-law to seize the territory of Peddapalayam or Periyapalayam near Madras and the neighborhood of Pulicat and see the country rendered obedient to him. According to the Dutch records of January 1657, Koneri Chetty, who was entrusted with the operations on behalf of Sri Rangaraya, betrayed his master and made overtures to Tubaki Krishnappa of Gingee, who had become Mir Jumla's lieutenant. And the latter, that is Tubaki Krishnappa, is said to have inflicted a defeat upon Sri Ranga in September 1657. The letters of Greenhill and Chamber from Madras in January 1657 mentioned the treachery of Koneri Chetty, who was the general of the Raya in the districts around Punamalli, and charged him with having neglected the subjugation of Punamalli castle and delayed till the enemy overpowered him. Koneri Chetty gave himself up to the Muhammadans as a prisoner, quote, but was received in state by the commanders with more than accustomed honor in such cases, which, considered with his alliance and near relation to Topa Krishnappa, the Nabab's general, together with other circumstances and observations in his present deport and continued respect from Ditto Krishnappa, are sufficient to ground the general suspicion of his betraying the king's army. End of quote. From the report made to the company by Greenhill and Chamber on January 28, 1657. A letter from Batavia, written towards the end of January 1657, mentions that Sri Ranga had by that time captured the pagoda of Tirupati and designed the conquest of the districts of Kanjivaram, Chingalput and Pulicat, and now requested the Dutch at the last place either to help him by getting for him the Nawab's treasures secured there for safety, or at least to remain neutral in the event of his making an attack on that place. Mir Jumla had by this time betaken himself to the Mughal court at Agra. His general, Tubaki Krishnappa, who was an experienced soldier, gained an advantage over the Raya's army in an engagement from which they fled precipitately and ignominiously in the direction of Arni, a strong castle on the borders of Gingee. From Arni, they were trying to get the alliance of the Bijapurians in order to take the field with greater force than before. In the meantime, Tubaki Krishnappa was reported to have strengthened himself by all possible means in order to see whether he could not gain an advantage over the Raya before he should seek help from the Bijapurians. Taking advantage of the absence of Mir Jumla, the Golconda forces began to attack Tubaki Krishnappa in the neighborhood of Punamalli. In August 1658, there was fighting between Tubaki Krishnappa and the Golconda troops around Punamalli. Tubaki Krishnappa came to terms with the governor of Fort St. George, with whom he had been on inimical terms, in order that he might be free for this struggle with Golconda. We learn from the Madras factors that Krishnappa besieged the castle of Punamalli, which had revolted to the king of Golconda. In October 1658, Kuli Beg, the commandant of the Golconda forces, inflicted a serious defeat on Tubaki Krishnappa, who was wounded and taken prisoner. The victor subdued all the districts around Madras. The settlement of Santhom submitted to him, and the Dutch at Pulicat came to terms with him. In the next year, 1659, there was further fighting. Bijapur had definitely gone over to the side of the Raya, and Rustam-e Zaman Bahlol Khan and Shaji, who were regarded as great friends at the Bijapur court, were expected to march across the Carnatic to Gingee with a large number of troops and overthrow the government of Krishnappa. Shaji was to proceed from his government in the Mysore country to Gingee. We now come to the final sacking of Gingee and the fall of Tubaki Krishnappa. 1659 was therefore a very eventful year in which Bijapur got into a definite occupation of Gingee. It was also marked by the last death throes of the revivalist ambitions of Sriranga at the recovery of his dominions and by the death of Kantira Vanarasa of Mysore and of Tirumala Nayak of Madura. Flushed with the conquest of Gingee, the Muslims advanced upon Tanjore and wrought there incalculable havoc. The Nayak hid himself in the forests and allowed the enemy to plunder and devastate the country. Thus, after conquering a vast country and subduing two powerful rulers and gathering incalculable treasures, the Muslim army returned triumphantly to Bijapur. The Emperor Sriranga III continued his efforts to recover his lost territories. And Father Proenza has observed in his letter of 1659 thus, quote, encouraged by the good reception and help of the king of Mysore, he took advantage of the absence of the Bijapuri general in the Deccan and advanced with an army of Mysoreans to expel the army of Golconda. End of quote. He concluded then that if the three Nayaks had joined the emperor with all the troops they could gather, success would have attended their efforts. There was unfortunately no union amongst the Nayaks, and especially Tirumala Nayaka did not cooperate with him but assumed the role of a hostile power. Sriranga III, having failed in his attempts, had to take refuge in Mysore, where he led a miserable life. End of the chapter, followed by some appendices account of the operations of the capture of Gingee in 1648 as recorded in the Muhammad Nama and the Basatin al-Salatin. Before that, we will see the notes. Okay, the first note. The ambition of Tirumala was based on the example of Raja Udayar of Mysore, who captured Seringapatam in 1610 and put an end to the imperial viceroyalty. And it was also, in one aspect, a continuation of the policy of Muttu Veerappa, who cherished the ambition of independence against the empire, which became weaker as Madura gained in strength. End of note. Next note. The policy of the Nayaks of Madura generally, since the commencement of the new century at any rate, cannot be regarded as having taken into calculation the actual political condition of the times. The empire was struggling for existence during the first 40 years of the century and had barely succeeded in maintaining its existence by being driven successively out from one capital on to another. Penukonda had to be vacated because of the constant harrying of the Mohammedan invasions. Chandragiri had similarly to be abandoned, and early in the reign of Sriranga III, Vellore was being laid siege to. These changes did not happen in a short campaign or two, but by persistent effort during a period of 3 decades. The absorption of the Chennapatna viceroyalty by Mysore enabled her to make a stand against the aggressions of Bijapur, which were now under the guidance of a man of genius, Shaji the Maratha. The whole brunt of the efforts of Golconda had to be borne by the empire practically single handed. If Tirumala had only realized this serious situation of the Hindus and had the foresight to perceive the political consequences of the disintegrating movement of which he had made himself the sponsor, if not the author, he would certainly have adopted a policy of cooperation with the empire. The question of Tirumala's loyalty or disloyalty therefore depends upon the question whether, in the political conditions of his time, he could have foreseen the direct results of his action. The action of his predecessors and their attitude towards the empire must necessarily have made it impossible for him to take an impartial view of the situation at the time. The interests of Mysore and the empire ran together a great way. From Dr. S. Krishnaswamy Iyengar, pages 118 to 119 of R. Satyanatha Iyer's History of the Nayaks of Madura. Indeed, we have no positive evidence to prove that Tirumala prepared for war against his overlord even from the beginning of his rule. He was careful to make himself strong in defense. Even later on, he was not disposed to be aggressive. Why he began to organize the defenses of his dominions even at the outset of his reign is not quite clear. His first idea was probably to send occasional presents to the Raya instead of any regular tribute. But he was not allowed to continue the ambiguous relationship for long. End of quote. See letter from Madras of October 9, 1647. End of note. Note on page 174. 17th December 1649. Sarkar, History of Aurangzeb, Volume 1, page 254. Note on page 177. Quote, and all the country hereabouts, Punnamalli castle excepted, rendered to the Gentoo king's obedience, who now in the Nabob's presence is up in arms for the recovering of his kingdom, and hath already recovered a large part. End of quote. Quote, next from a letter sent by the Madras factors to Bantam, dated November 5, we learn that, quote, all these countries that were formerly conquered by the Nawab are now of late in his absence at the Mughals' court upon the revolt, the Gentoo king with divers Nags being in arms, some of whose forces are now at the siege of Paliakat, where it is said most of the Nawab's riches are stowed. Here is nothing but taking and retaking of places with parties of both sides in all places, so that it is very dangerous giving out monies for goods in these times. But we hope before long it will be settled, especially for us if the king recovers his country. End of quote. note on page 181. The one consequence of the fall of the Vijayanagara Empire was the expansion of the Mohammedans further south. Golconda retained mastery over the Carnatic plains to the banks of the South Pennar comprising Guntur, Nellore, North Arcot and Chingalpur districts, while Bijapur was allowed to hold the rest of the Carnatic. Professor Rangacharya remarks, quote, what Malik Kafur failed to do and what the Bahmani sultans and their successors failed to do for centuries was now done by the treachery of Tirumala Nayak. End of quote. Mr. R. Satyanatha Iyer, in his Nayaks of Madura, takes the other side of the question and says that Sri Ranga did not seem to have considered the practicability of revitalizing the empire in the teeth of provincial opposition. Quote, what was witnessed at Ragas Tagdi or Talikota in 1565 was repeated at Gingee in 1649. The Muhammadan powers perceived their strength and were determined to use it for themselves. They found a way in the disunity of the Nayaks and utilized it to their own advantage. Ever since the Battle of 1565, the feudatories of the empire were caring more for their separate interests than for the imperial ones. Moreover, the civil war of 1614 to 17 had damaged the prestige of the empire and accentuated the provincial interests. End of quote. Appendices. Account of the operations of the capture of Gingee in 1648 as recorded in the Muhammad Nama and the Basatin al-Salatin. Finding Gingee impregnable, Mir Jumla succeeded in securing the assistance of the Bijapur army. Thereupon, Tirumala Nayak of Madura, deserted by his Muslim friends, began to actively help the besieged. He also succeeded in fanning the flames of enmity between Golconda and Bijapur, and the effect of his diplomacy was the raising of the siege by Mir Jumla. The latter retired to make new acquisitions in the present Kadapa district and to consolidate his previous conquests. Thus, the Bijapuri army was left alone to conduct the siege. There was further trouble ahead. The principal commanders like Shaji, Khairiat Khan, and Siddhi Raihan were dissatisfied with Mustafa Khan, and their insubordination and non cooperation naturally prolonged the operations. Sometime after, Mustafa himself succumbed to old age and died in harness there on 9th November 1648. The command passed on to first to Malik Raihan and then to Muzaffaruddin, Khan-e-Khanam Khan, and Muhammad. With the heroic assistance of Afzal Khan, the fort is said to have been ultimately reduced in December 1648. According to the Basatin il-Salatin, Roop Nayak, quote, the Raja of Gingee was very proud and wealthy. His family had been in possession of the fort for 700 years. Being given to a licentious and luxurious life, he had neglected the affairs of his kingdom. As he was not helped by the neighboring chiefs during the siege, and because his provisions and fodder were exhausted, he was ultimately forced to surrender the fort to the Bijapurians on 28 November 1648. Besides the vast quantities of wealth plundered by the soldiers for themselves, the Bijapuri army got hold of all the accumulated riches of the Gingee rulers. It amounted to 4 crores of hoons and 20 crores of rupees in cash and jewels. End of quote. Quote, the country which had nothing except idol worship and infidelity for thousands of centuries was illuminated with the light of Islam through the endeavors and good wishes of the king. The treasures, gems, jewels, and other property worth 4 crores of hoons were added to the imperial treasury. Mosques were erected in the cities which were full of temples, and the preachers and criers were appointed in order to propagate the Mohammedan religion. End of quote. All the Muslim army was not employed in reducing the fort of Gingee. It appears from the English records that in this campaign, the Bijapur rulers employed the well-known Pindaris for the wanton desolation and devastation of the land. This fact is worth noticing since afterwards Shivaji followed in the footsteps of the Muslim rulers in some of his activities. His system of plunder was surely more humane than the one that was used by the Bijapuri warlords in the Carnatic. Quote, Nations who lie within 2 days' journey one of another with powerful armies, watching all advantage upon each other, yet both strive to make a prey of this miserable and distracted or divided people. These are the Golconda and the Vijapur, that is Bijapur Moors, the latter of which hath brought in 8,000 freebooters who receive no pay but plunder what they can, whose incursions, robberies, and devastations hath brought desolation on a great part of the country round about, especially the three prime cloth ports, Tevanampatam, Porto Novo, and Pullacherry, that is Pondicherry, of which the two last are in a manner ruined, the other hardly preserving itself in a poor condition with continual presents. End of quote. Flushed with the conquest of Gingee, the Muslim lords advanced into the territories of Madura and Tanjore. Both the both the weak-minded Nayaks shut themselves up in inaccessible forests and allowed the enemy to plunder and devastate the country in the manner described above. Finally, they opened negotiations and submitted to the Muslims. Thus, after threatening two powerful Nayaks, gathering incalculable treasures, and without losing many men, the army returned to Bijapur. Gingee should have finally fallen in 1658, shortly before Tirumala Nayak's death. Orme has placed the conquest of Gingee by Bijapur about 1655 AD. The date 1658 AD can be accepted as here we have got the corroborating evidence of the letter of Father Proenza dated 1659 AD, which deals with the capture of the place by the Bijapur forces. Gingee suffered much from the cruelties of the Mohammedans, as is evidenced by the Jesuit letter dated 1666 from Andrew Frere to Paul Oliva. Quote, "Nothing can equal the cruelties which the Mohammedans employ in the government of Gingee. Expression fails me to recount the atrocities which I have seen with my own eyes." End of quote. Another letter of 1662 from Poenza to Oliva says that, quote, "The people were not very uneasy thereby. They sufficiently accommodated themselves to the yoke of the conqueror." End of quote. Number 2. Attempts at the restoration of the Nayak dynasty of Gingee, 1660. An energetic prince, Chokkanatha Nayak of Madura, the successor of Tirumala Nayak, reversed the policy of his predecessor and made preparations to carry out the ambitious scheme of an offensive war against the Mohammedans and to restore the old political order of things. Chokkanatha was aided in this by his Pradhani, the Rayasam, and the Dalavai. The Dalavai, Lingama Nayaka, was sent with an army of 40,000 men to drive Shaji Sagosi of the Jesuit letter, who was one of the commanders of the Bijapuri forces employed in the conquest of Gingee, from Gingee and take possession of it. Lingama procrastinated with the plan and enriched himself with bribes from the Mohammedan generals. The ministers at Madura hatched a plot in the meanwhile to dethrone Chokkanatha Nayak and put his younger brother in his place. Chokkanatha heard about it and punished them with death. Lingama, who was also a member of the plot, joined Shaji and persuaded him to besiege Trichinopoly. Chokkanatha was successful in driving them, and Lingama and Shaji had to flee to Tanjore and thence to Gingee. Thus, this earnest attempt of Chokkanatha to restore the old order of things, and especially to restore the Nayak line of Gingee, was frustrated by intrigues at his own court. His failure has been recorded in the Jesuit letter of Proenza to Oliva, dated Trichinopoly, 1662. Bijapur was in possession of the fortress of Gingee till 1677, when the famous Sivaji, the son of Shaji, fell upon it in his momentous Carnatic expedition. The inscriptions 860-861 of 1918, which are dated 1671 AD and found at Tiruparankundram, refer to Varadappa Nayak and his gifts to the temple there on his return from a pilgrimage to Sethu Rameswaram. Probably this Nayak had the nominal title, being the last descendant of the old Nayak line of Gingee. Orme has referred to the fact that the title Nayak was used long after the establishment of the Muhammadans by certain representatives of the old line of rulers. Number 3. Social and general conditions under the Nayak rulers of Gingee. Revenue. The gradual expansion of the Vijayanagara Empire made it so unwieldy for one monarch to have control over all its parts that it had to be divided into provinces that were entrusted to the Nayaks and other feudal chiefs. Such provinces were those of Madura, Tanjore, and Gingee. Quote, the letter of Provenza to Nikhil, dated Trichinopoli 1652, refers to the three Nayaks being the feudatories of Narasingha of Vijayanagar. End of quote. Another traveler, John Newhoff, had also referred in his travels and voyages in the East Indies to the three great Nayaks. These Nayaks were very powerful and they paid a tribute of 6 to 10 million francs to the government of Vijayanagar. The revenue administration of the empire was so excellent and systematic that the sources of revenue were finally fixed and reduced to a regular form. Whenever the central government showed any signs of weakness, the feudatories became unpunctual in their payment and even sometimes openly refused to acknowledge their obligations. The total revenue of the Vijayanagara Empire has been considered to be very great, unparalleled in South India. Foreign travelers like Pais and Nunis have given accounts of revenue of the feudatories of the empire. Moreover, the splendor of Vijayanagara excited their astonishment. Vardhima wrote in 1502, quote, the king of Narasingha is the richest monarch. His Brahman priests say that he has a revenue of 12,000 parodas a day. End of quote. According to tradition, Krishnadevaraya derived 3 crores of rupees from the districts of Karnataka. Thus, we find that the empire was rich and powerful. No wonder each Nayak was powerful and was remitting to the central treasury annually 6 to 10 million francs, which amounted to pound 24,000 to 40,000 pounds. The tribute was one third of the total revenue, and hence the income of each Nayak should have been about 120,000 pounds annually. If the country was not prosperous, such an amount of revenue could have hardly been realized by the central power. The letter of the Jesuit Vico, dated Madura, the 30th August 1611, refers to the fact that on the refusal of the Nayak to pay tribute, the Vijayanagara monarch sent one of his generals with 1 lakh men to demand it by force. On such occasions, the poor paid heavily for the default of the rulers. The country was devastated and the people plundered and massacred. This view of the Jesuits seems to be exaggerated. The Nayaks of Gingee were paying an equal amount of tribute with those of Madura and Tanjore. In the material relating to the Bijapur conquest of Gingee in 1658, the Nayak of Gingee was described in the different records as the richest and the proudest of monarchs. The Basatin al-Salatin gives us an idea of the total acquired by the Muhammadans. It says, quote, the total wealth amounted to 4 crores of hoons or 20 crores of rupees in cash and jewels. Another Jesuit letter from the year 1659, Provenza to Nikhil, stated that the booty acquired by the Mohammedans was immense, consisting of silver, gold, and pearls and precious stones of inestimable value. The condition of the people. The Hindus have ever been noted for their hospitality to foreign travelers and envoys. Travelers of the Vijayanagara period like Abdur Razak and Nikitin have given details of how they were hospitably treated. They were assigned lofty mansions for lodging and feasted very well. The Jesuit travelers of the reign of Venkatavan were also hospitably treated wherever they went, and the Nayak viceroys and other feudatories imitated their masters in this as in other matters. Father Pimenta, who visited the court of Krishnappa Nayaka of Gingee in 1599 AD, has told us how he was received at the court. Quote, the Nayak of Gingee was come hither in whose dominions it standeth. He commanded that we should be brought to his presence. He appointed our lodging in the tower, though the heat forced us to the grove nearby. Whatever was rare and precious in the fort was shown to the fathers. He entertained us kingly and marveled much that we chewed not the leaves of betel which were offered to us, and dismissed us with gifts of precious cloths wrought with gold, and desiring a priest of us for his new city which he was building. End of quote. Krishnappa Nayaka of Gingee allowed Father Pimenta to build a church in Krishnapatam, that is Porto Novo, which he had built, and even gave a large endowment of 200 pieces of gold for the purpose. This grant was made in the presence of all the nobles of the court. At the end of 1608, an embassy from the Dutch traders arrived at Krishnappa Nayaka's court at Gingee, requesting permission to establish themselves at Devanampatnam fort near Kadalur. According to the Jesuit letter of 1609, the Nayak received the Dutch very hospitably and allowed them to build a citadel at the place of landing. The letters of Father Pimenta throw light on some of the peculiar customs and ceremonies of the Nayak court of Gingee, like the purificatory rites. The customs and manners of the Hindus seemed peculiar and fantastic to the foreigners, and the strange and curious observations of Father Pimenta are largely due to his ignorance of the ancient customs of the land. His description of Krishnappa Nayaka reveals the orthodox surroundings of the ruler. Quote, the Nayak showed us his golden staff, among which were two great pots carried on men's shoulders full of water for the king to drink. End of quote. Men who returned from the north generally brought in such vessels Ganges water for the use of the king. It was always considered so sacred that it was used for purificatory purposes. The anxiety of the people to perform purificatory ceremonies on their pollution caused by their association with foreigners is illustrated in a number of epigraphs. According to Father Pimenta, tilting, that is, a kind of martial exercise, was practiced in the court of Gingee in 1597 AD. Great importance was attached to games and amusements in the festival seasons in the Vijayanagara days. These games were an index of the martial character of the people. The Vijayanagara people were more attracted by fencing, dueling, wrestling, and hunting than by sedentary amusements. Fencing and dueling seem to have been held in high repute in the land. Castanheda, in his History of Portugal, writes thus of Vijayanagar, quote, there were many duels on account of love of women, wherein many men lost their lives. End of quote. Barbosa, another traveler, has also referred to the wide prevalence of such dueling. According to Nunes, great honor was done to those who fought in a duel. Pace, writing about 1520, has informed us that women too were engaged in wrestling, which was another of their pastimes. During festivals, women were said to have wrestled in a large arena in the presence of the nobles and the king. Thus, foreign travelers have given accounts of the various games and amusements practiced at Vijayanagara, and these were given sufficient encouragement by the monarchs themselves. The provincial viceroys followed their master, and hence in the court of Krishnappa Nayaka of Gingee, tilting with swords was practiced. The splendor and magnificence of the court of Krishnappa Nayaka of Gingee is best visualized from the account of Father Pimenta. He writes of the Nayak thus, quote, we found him lying on a silken carpet leaning on two cushions with a long silken garment, a great chain hanging from the neck, distinguished with many pearls and gems all over his breast, his long hair tied with a knot on the crown adorned with pearls. Some princes and Brahmins attended him. He was guarded homeward with 1,000 armed men. The streets were ranked with 300 elephants as if fitted for war. At the porch of the entrance of the palace, one entertained the Nayak with an oration in his praise, a thing usual in their solemn pomp. Krishnappa Nayaka then showed him and his companions his store of jewels and gave them leave in his new city, which he was then building. Father Du Jorik has described the gaudy dress of the orator in red robes. Thus, we are enabled to get a picture of the pomp of the Nayak of Gingee. The palace of the Nayak at Gingee. According to Father Pimenta, the residences of the Nayak were noble and prominent, being built in a peculiar style and equipped with towers and verandas. The Nayak had two such palaces, one inside the fort and the other in the city or the Peta of Gingee. The gates of the palaces were carefully guarded, and when anybody entered them with permission, there followed the firing of the guns, the parade of the soldiers, and the soundings of the buglers. Pace has given a vivid description of the royal palace of Vijayanagara. Regarding the residences of the nobles, there are but meager notices available from our travelers. The private dwellings were plain and not elaborate, except those belonging to the rich and influential people. Father Harras has referred to the spacious houses found in Gingee. Very probably they belonged to the nobles. Barbosa has written in one of his passages thus, quote, "In the city as well, there are palaces after the royal fashion, with many enclosed courts and great houses very well built, and with wide open spaces with water tanks full of fish in great numbers, wherein dwell the great lords and governors." End of quote. Pace had written that the houses of the army captains and other rich and honorable men were adorned with many figures and decorations that were pleasing to look at. The habitations of the ordinary people were modest in appearance. Generally, a house had a garden around it, and it was usually built of bricks and tiles. According to the Karnataka inscription of 1372, Epigraphica Karnataka, Volume 4, GU 34, the houses in the Karnataka and the Tamil countries were built according to standard rules. Barbosa informs us that the houses of the poorer classes were generally covered with thatch, but nonetheless well built, and they were arranged according to the respective occupations of the owners in long streets with many open spaces. An inscription of the year 1632 of the reign of Sriranga, 65 of 1922, registers an undertaking by the residents of the village of Tiruvamathur in the South Arcot district. The three artisan communities are Kammala, carpenters, blacksmiths, and goldsmiths of the several villages in the northern ward, should no longer be ill-treated or deprived of their privileges, and that the same rights and privileges as were being enjoyed by their brethren in Padaiveedu, Senji, Tiruvannamalai, and Kanchipuram should be accorded to them, and that in case of default, a fine of 12 pon was to be paid by the residents. The record has mentioned by name Krishnappa Nayaka, probably the well-known Nayak of Gingee of the time. The above record throws light on the occasional interference in social affairs that was indulged in by the state. Such interferences generally concern the mutual relations and respective rights of the minor communities of weavers and artisans, and often took place at the request of the people themselves. The government carefully inquired into the disputes and settled the details, which were mostly about trivial formalities that, however, caused much concern in the locality. The state had settled similar questions under the Cholas. In the Vijayanagara period, we have numerous instances illustrating state interference in social matters. An inscription of Saka 1407 AD, equivalent to 1485-86, 473 of 1921, refers to the privileges granted to the Kaikolars of using tandu or palanquin and conch as their insignia carried in processions on festive and other occasions on the model of those of Kanchipuram who were enjoying those privileges. Another inscription of AD 1546, 41 of 1922 refers to Surappa Nayak, the governor over the Tiruvati Rajyam, who enacted similar measures in connection with Ilaivaniyars who were accorded the same privileges as the Kaikolars of the place. The inscription of 1632 AD already referred to, 65 of 1922, is one of such instances of the interference of the state. These indicate the care bestowed by the government in maintaining the needed equilibrium of the privileges among the different communities, particularly of the trading and industrial sections of the population. The continued vitality of the Hindu Empire required a proper encouragement of the commercial and agricultural castes, who were very keen that their hereditary rights and privileges should be unimpaired and thus be helped to maintain the social harmony and the material prosperity of the land. The Barbar, the Kaikolar, and the Kammalar castes had been prominent in the Vijayanagara country and deemed to have been greatly serviceable to the state. The privileges demanded by these communities on the basis of precedents were therefore readily conceded if they did not result in collision. Relative harmony was thus established among the various communities. The offering of the betel leaf and areca nuts to guests has been an ancient practice of the Hindus and other immigrant communities. The offering of the betel leaf and nuts is the first as well as the last courtesy that one is expected to show to a guest. The author of the Sikraniti has mentioned the presentation of the betel leaf and nuts. This peculiar system ought to have originated in southern India and was said to have been practiced by the Yadavas of Devagiri. It was one of the acknowledged modes of conferring honor and recognition on warriors and statesmen. The offer of the betel leaf in royal assemblies and military reviews had a political significance besides and played a conspicuous part in the social life of the people. Foreign travelers that visited the Vijayanagara country have told us of the presentation of the betel leaf by the king to the generals on formal occasions. They have also indicated the importance of the betel leaf in the everyday life of the people. An inscription at Yennayiram in the Sautarkad district, report 332 of 1917 of Sadasiva Maharaya dated Saka 1467 refers to the provision made for presenting the betel leaf offering in the temple of Alagiya Singaperumal Swami. When Father Pimenta and his companions visited the court of Krishnappa Nayaka at Gingee in 1599 AD, the latter is said to have marveled much that we chewed not the leaves of betel which he offered us. This shows that the offering of betel leaf as an invariable sign of courtesy and respect was in vogue even in the case of the reception of foreigners. We have already seen that the Nayak rule in the Gingee country enabled the strengthening and further fortification of the capital and the construction of forts in many strategical places. The temples and mantapams in the capital were largely the handiwork of the Nayaks. The Venkateramana Swami temple at the foot of the Rajagiri hill has already been referred to as having been built by one Mutyalu Nayakan, about whom we have no authentic information, though his name is mentioned in the dynastic lists furnished by the Mackenzie manuscripts. The Kalyana Mantapam, a most peculiar structure in the fortress of Rajagiri, must have also been built by the Nayaks, for it is marked by the Mantapam style of construction, so characteristic of the Vijayanagara period. According to Mackenzie manuscripts, one Krishnappa, probably the first Krishnappa, is said to have built the Kalyana Mahal. Quote, his long and peaceful administration resulted in the expansion of the town of Gingee and the founding of many petas and suburbs. His successor, Achyuta Ramachandra Nayak, is said to have built the temples of Tiruvannamalai and Tindivanam. End of quote. According to the same source, we know that the images of Krishnappa and of his successors were sculptured on the pillars of the temples at Srimushnam and at Tirukkoilur, as well as in several other temples of the district. The Tiruvikrama Perumal temple of Tirukkoilur bears prominently the marks of the Vijayanagara style of architecture. The earliest part of the temple is supposed to be the mantapam in front of the shrine of the goddess. The sculptures of some of the pillars seem to have been removed by later pillages. The mutilation of the sculptures of these temples has been attributed to the vandalism of Hyder Ali's troops in the course of his descents into the Carnatic country. Among the figures that were thus injured were the portraits of the Gingee Nayaks, which had been carved on the pillars of the Kalyana Mantapam in front of the Amman shrine, which, being 55.5 feet by 31.5 feet in dimension, is considered to be the biggest of the kind in the presidency. The Vaishnava temple of Srimushnam contains a fine and spacious 16-pillared mantapam which bears on its pillars the sculptures of several of the Nayak rulers of the period. The sculptures are held to be those of Achyutappa Nayak of Tanjore and of his three brothers. Achyutappa is traditionally regarded as the rebuilder of the temple, and the figures of his brothers are known as Ananta, Govinda, and Kondalu respectively. Other kinds of sculptures in the Mantapam are representative of the Vijayanagara style. In Venkatammal Petai, a village 14 miles southwest of Kadalur and one of the Panch Mahals, There are two mantapams which are considered to have been constructed by Venkatammal, who gave her name to the village and who was the sister of one of the Nayaks of Gingee. The Mackenzie manuscripts refer to one Venkatapati Nayak who persecuted the Jainas in 1478 AD. The diary of Anandaranga Pillai frequently refers to Venkatammal Pettai as an important place. Venkatammal might have been the sister of Venkatapati Nayak. The great Krishnappa Nayak of Gingee, the contemporary of Venkata I, built the town of Krishnapatam, that is the modern Hindu portion of Porto Novo, which was named after him. The village of Agaram near the Porto Novo railway station can be identified with Krishnapatam. When Father Pimenta, the Jesuit, visited the Nayak in 1599 AD, the town was under construction. According to the Jesuits' letter, the Nayak allowed everybody to select his own building site, and a piece of land was assigned to each in the outskirts of the city for agricultural purposes. He also allowed the Jesuits to build a church in the town and even granted an endowment of 200 pieces of gold for the building of the church and for the residence of a priest. End of quote. We have dealt already with Krishnappa Nayaka's religious activities. He favored, in an abundant measure, the Sri Vaishnava faith, and in that respect he followed faithfully the attitude of his master Venkata I. His conduct at the Chidambaram temple, which marked his religious bigotry, has also already been dealt with. The great Vijayanagara Empire started to stem the tide of Muhammadan invasion and dominion, gradually expanded and covered such a vast area that it was divided into various provinces ruled by the Nayaks and other feudatories. Each provincial viceroy tried to maintain the prestige of the Hindu power by following the footsteps of his master. Though the Battle of Talikota in 1565 had shaken the prestige of the Hindu Empire, the rulers were able to recover in a very few years their old power, though in a more restricted region, so that at the end of the 16th century, their state was still reckoned as an important power, capable of using and willing to use its power and resources before for the promotion of Hindu culture. The Nayaks paid allegiance to the Raya even after 1565 and continued to do so nominally at least till 1614. Then the Great Civil War of 1614 to 17 destroyed the remainder of the waning prestige of the empire, and the Nayaks, excepting the ruler of Tanjore, threw themselves in open opposition to the Raya. The ill-planned and traitorous policy of Tirumala Nayak of Madura brought about the Muhammadan invasion of Gingee, which also surely affected Tanjore and Madura. The Nayak of Madura, in alliance with his brother of Gingee, resisted the last efforts of Sri Ranga III to restore the power of the empire and brought in the Muslim occupation of the land. Though the empire disappeared before the onslaughts of the Mohammedans, it had left to the Hindus of the south its vast heritage in religion, social life, literature, fine arts, architecture, and learning. The modern Hindus of the south have largely adopted or imbibed the ideals of life practiced at and encouraged by the court of Vijayanagara, and they still look back with pride to the glorious past that had given such a valuable legacy for the generations that have followed. Okay, end of the appendices. Let's go back and find the notes. Okay, appendices. Okay, note on page 191. This is a Persian history of the Adil Shahs down to Aurangzeb's conquest with a brief summary of subsequent events and contains 8 sections called Basatin. An Urdu translation in Nagari character was published of the work at Baroda. The author completed the work in 1822 and intended it for presentation to J.C. Grant Duff. End of quote. Note on page 200. The betel leaf was a hoary indigene of India and the Indochina regions. The word is derived from Malayalam vettila, that is veru plus ila, simple leaf, through the Portuguese corruption thereof, beter and betel. For long, the sale of betel leaf was a monopoly of the company in its early settlements. Marco Polo, Abdur Razak, Vasco da Gama, Valdemar, Barbosa, and all the earlier European travelers have remarked on the use of the betel. And Sir Thomas Roe has also noticed the distribution of betel leaf and arecanut as well as coconuts among the folk assembled at any important function. The betel leaf bearer, Tambula Karandavahin, has been from the earliest times an important household functionary in the royal court. The first Nayak of Tanjore was the betel leaf page to his royal master. End of quote. Quote in page 201. Sorry, note in page 201. A record of the year 1924, that is 426 of 1924 report of Sevappa Nayaka of Tanjore, engraved on the Pushya Mantapa of Tiruvadi near Tanjore, refers to the steps of the ghat in the river called the Kalyana Sindhu being built by him. The adjoining buildings of the bathing ghat go also by the name of Kalyana Mahal. Hence, we find the prefix Kalyana attached to prominent structures under the Nayaks. Next note, volume 1, page 353. Okay, so ends chapter 5. We'll close the. Actually, before closing, I would like to say something about this book. Goodness, I have to make this comment. Somewhere here, I noticed that he said that he had already written about those some things, which is actually very rare because Srinivasachari is given to endless repetitions. He simply repeats things so much that actually now I have really read up to 200 pages nearly. But I would say nearly more than 100 pages of it is mostly repetitions. So if all the repetitions were avoided, the portion up till now might have come to one half or even one third of the total. I don't know where. Somewhere he says, you know, wait, I think it's nearer to the end. It has been referred to earlier. He says that word. Okay, that is the only place where I felt. Okay, this is the paragraph in page 204 where he says, we have dealt already with Krishnappa Nayaka's religious activities. And in the final sentences also, his religious bigotry has also already been dealt with. This thing that this consciousness that he had already dealt with something is something that's not to be seen at all till here in Srinivasachari's prose. He repeats and repeats and repeats things to the point of boredom, basically. But this is the first place where he seems to. I don't know whether it is actually his incompetence as a historian, or probably he was actually padding to increase the size of his book, What was his motive, or whether it was conscious or unconscious, I don't know. But this book is a book of endless repetitions. Very bad instance of history writing. Okay, with that comment of mine, let's end this chapter, this video.